When Mara Bennett received a message from her mother 3 days before Thanksgiving, she expected the usual reminder about travel plans, but instead she read a single sentence that made her stare at the screen. "We're keeping Thanksgiving small this year, so it'll just be your brother and his family." There was no invitation, no apology, and not even an explanation, so Mara simply typed, "Understood, have a nice holiday," placed her phone face down, and looked through the window of her apartment in Seattle at the rain sliding down the glass, unaware that within a few weeks the family that had spent years overlooking her would discover just how completely she had rebuilt her life without them. Mara had grown up in a family where attention was treated like a limited resource, and her younger brother, Julian, somehow always received most of it because he was charming, athletic, and effortlessly good at turning ordinary achievements into family celebrations, while Mara was the quiet child who repaired broken electronics, stayed late at the library, and preferred solving problems to talking about them. When Mara won a regional engineering competition at 17, her father barely looked up from his phone before asking whether Julian had made the basketball team, and that moment stayed with her because it taught her something painful. In her parents' world, her accomplishments were interesting only when they could be compared with someone else's. After graduating from the University of Washington, Mara moved to Austin and started working for a small software company, where she spent years learning how businesses actually survived when money was tight and mistakes were expensive, eventually leaving her comfortable job to develop a cybersecurity platform from a rented garage with 2 former colleagues. The company nearly collapsed twice. One investor walked away after a disastrous presentation, and there were months when Mara ate cheap takeout at her desk while wondering whether she had made the biggest mistake of her life. But instead of calling her parents for help, she remembered her father's old advice: choose something practical, and decided she would prove practicality did not have to mean giving up on herself. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when a regional hospital network tested Mara's security system and discovered that it could identify unusual digital activity far faster than the software they were already using, leading to contracts with hospitals, universities, and eventually major financial institutions across the country. Within 6 years, Mara had transformed the struggling startup into a highly valued technology company, and when a larger corporation offered to acquire it for an amount that changed the course of her life, she signed the agreement quietly, paid her team generously, and made one decision she never told her family about. She purchased an abandoned historic lodge outside Bozeman, Montana, restored it into a stunning mountain retreat, and began building a life that had nothing to do with winning her parents' approval. She deliberately kept the property private because she knew exactly what would happen if her family discovered it too soon, as every conversation would suddenly become about money, connections, favors, and what Mara could do for them. So instead, she invited teachers who had encouraged her, former employees, neighbors, old college friends, and people who had supported her during the years when nobody else seemed to notice what she was trying to build. The lodge slowly became more than a beautiful home, surrounded by pine forests and snow-covered peaks. It became a place where Mara hosted scholarship dinners, helped young entrepreneurs, and welcomed people who needed somewhere peaceful to feel valued, which was why her mother's Thanksgiving message hurt for only a few minutes before Mara realized she no longer needed an invitation to belong. The next morning, Mara called her longtime friend Daniel and said, "I have an idea, and you're probably going to tell me it's completely unreasonable," before explaining that she wanted to host her own Thanksgiving gathering and invite everyone who had been quietly excluded from her family's celebrations over the years. Daniel laughed and replied, "After everything you've built, unreasonable is probably the least interesting thing you could do." So Mara contacted her aunt, 2 cousins, an old family friend, several childhood neighbors, and even her former high school science teacher, and one by one they admitted they had received the same vague message about keeping the holiday simple and assumed they were not wanted. By Thanksgiving morning, the lodge was glowing beneath a fresh layer of snow, with lanterns lining the stone pathway, a roaring fire warming the great room, and long wooden tables covered with handmade place cards that Mara had written herself instead of ordering generic decorations from a store. A local chef named Celia arrived before sunrise with crates of food. Daniel handled the music and transportation, and Mara spent the morning walking from room to room making sure every guest had a comfortable place to sleep. Because for the first time, she wasn't trying to impress anyone with what she owned. She was creating the kind of gathering she had secretly wished for throughout her childhood. The first guests arrived shortly after noon, and their reactions were almost comical as they stepped from their cars and stared at the enormous timber lodge tucked between the mountains, with Aunt Renee whispering, "Mara, how long have you been living like this?" And Mara answering with a small smile, long enough to learn that a home is only special when people inside it feel welcome. Soon the rooms filled with laughter, old stories, children chasing each other through the hallway, and adults sitting around the fireplace comparing memories, while Mara watched people who had once spent holidays separated by awkward family politics suddenly reconnect around the same table. During dinner, Mara stood at the head of the table holding a glass of sparkling cider and admitted that she had once believed being ignored meant she wasn't important. But years of disappointment had taught her that rejection could become freedom when you stopped begging people to change. She raised her glass and said, "Tonight isn't about proving anything to the people who aren't here. It's about being grateful for the people who showed up." And the room became unexpectedly quiet before everyone lifted their glasses, while Mara's former teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, added, "You didn't build this place because you wanted people to envy you, Mara. You built it because you finally understood what you deserved." Later that evening, Mara's phone began vibrating repeatedly on a side table, and when she finally checked it, she discovered that one of her cousins had posted a photograph of the gathering online, accidentally revealing the lodge and the enormous Thanksgiving celebration to relatives who had assumed Mara was spending the holiday alone. Her mother called first, followed by her father and Julian, and her mother demanded to know why everyone was at Mara's house when the family had supposedly agreed to keep Thanksgiving small. But Mara calmly replied, "You were free to choose who you wanted at your table, Mom, and I was free to choose who I wanted at mine," before her father asked the question that revealed exactly what he cared about most. "Mara, how did you afford a place like that?" Mara did not answer immediately because she suddenly realized the years of silence had protected her from having to explain herself, and instead she said, "I built a company, sold it, and built a life afterward, but none of that is the reason everyone came here tonight. They came because they know what it feels like to be welcomed." Her mother became defensive. Julian accused her of embarrassing the family, and Mara finally told them that she hadn't organized the dinner to punish anyone, adding, "You didn't lose your place at my table because you couldn't afford to be here. You lost it because you kept treating love like something people had to earn," before ending the call and returning to the dining room where everyone was still laughing. A month later, Mara received 3 handwritten letters instead of the usual texts, with Julian admitting that he had spent years enjoying the attention without realizing how much his sister had been pushed aside, her father acknowledging that he had confused achievement with worth, and her mother finally apologizing without making excuses or asking for anything in return. Mara invited them to visit after Christmas, but she established one condition before they arrived. There would be no discussion about her money, business, property, or what she could provide for the family. And when they finally stood together on the lodge's porch beneath a pale winter sunrise, her mother quietly said, "We should have noticed you much sooner," to which Mara answered, "Maybe, but I'm not going to spend the rest of my life waiting for people to see me." That evening, as snow drifted through the darkness and warm light spilled from the lodge windows, Mara sat at the same table where her Thanksgiving gathering had begun and watched her former teacher, friends, relatives, and even her parents share stories without competing for attention or trying to impress one another, finally understanding that the greatest victory wasn't the company's sale, the mountain property, or the wealth she had accumulated, but the fact that she no longer measured her worth by whether her family remembered to invite her. She had spent years believing she needed to earn a permanent seat at someone else's table, only to discover that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is build your own. Choose who brings kindness into the room, and stop confusing being excluded with being alone. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.